Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Today we have our very own Jenny Hollingsworth with us, and she will be discussing cash flow forecasting in Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2018. And we just have a few items to go over before we dive into this. First, all of our webinars are recorded, and this will be recorded, so you don't have to worry about that. If you'd like to go back and listen to it, you will have that option. We will have it on our website later this week for your viewing. And secondly, if you have any questions at all, please type them into the questions box, and we will get them called out at the end of our webinar for the Q&A section. So now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Jenny, and she will dive into our webinar today.
All right, thank you, Angie. Good morning, everyone. Like Angie said, we're going to talk about cash flow forecasting this morning. My name is Jenny Hollingsworth, and just a little bit of background on me for those of you who may not know me. I've been a senior application consultant with Innovia for the past probably 13-ish years. And then prior to that, I worked as a NAV application consultant at another partner for about 10 years. So some of you might have seen me, or I might have talked to some of you around the NAVLG Summit conferences. I've been there the past 7 years or so. If not, I look forward to meeting some of you at this year's conference in October. All right, so today, simple objective list. We're going to talk about how to set up cash flow forecasting and what ways can I run it. There's multiple methods that we can also run cash flow forecasting. I just wanted to give a slide here on when cash flow forecasting was introduced. So for those of you who are on NAV 2013 forward, cash flow forecasting is available, and they've made 2 improvements to cash flow forecasting in NAV 2017. They've added an assisted setup feature, and then also the Cortana Intelligence. So we'll be talking a little bit about those during the webinar as well. So for most of you, it's important that you have cash flow information you can rely on. And you want to be able to see that cash flow in your future weeks and months. So just a little background on NAV's cash flow. The cash flow forecast is always based on assumptions, of course, since we're calculating future cash flow. The cash flow in NAV is very flexible. So it allows you to create multiple different forecasts. You can suggest, add, delete, and modify entries in that forecast. It has the ability to, again, not only create multiple forecasts, but then you can save multiple forecasts. And it uses a number of cash flow sources from NAV in the GL, the purchasing, and the sales modules. And we're going to cover all those sources in one of the next few slides in detail. And also, lastly, we're going to talk a bit about the assisted setup, which is new in NAV 2017. It's a simple wizard that will walk you through setting up cash flow forecasting. And we'll look at that a little bit as well. All right, so what are the functions of the cash flow forecast? So I added a diagram here to show this. So first here in this first box, we see we set up the cash flow forecast. Next, we suggest the cash flow forecast from many different sources. We talked about GL, purchasing, sales, and so on. Again, we'll see that in the next slide. And then based on those entries suggested here, we'll then register the cash flow forecast entries, which will then save the cash flow entries. And these saved cash flow entries are then what we can start reporting upon. So down below here, you can see the 5 different areas that we can use for reporting. There is canned cash flow forecast reports. There's charts. We can use our analysis view by dimensions. Create an account schedule based on the cash flows. And then also here we can send our forecast to Excel. Okay. What are the cash flow forecasts? I'm sorry, cash flow sources in NAV. So in NAV, it takes into consideration the following sources. Our receivables balance, what our customers owe us and when, payables, what we owe our vendors and when, our liquid funds, what cash do we have on hand in our bank accounts, the manual expenses and revenues. So those first three, the receivables, payables, and liquid funds, they're based on posted entries within NAV. But if you want to take into account amounts not already posted, and for example, that you can't post yet, an example would be salaries. We know we have salaries we have to pay out this year, but we can't exactly post them yet, but we want those to be taken into account in the cash flow. So that's one example. Also, all of our open POs and sales orders, fixed assets, budgets, disposals. An example there would, we have a budgeted for a fixed asset that we will acquire in a couple of months, or maybe we have a planned disposal that will have a positive impact on our total cash flow. We can take those into account as well. For those of you who use the service management module, it will take into account service orders. Our GL budgets. I think in manual expenses, I gave the example of salaries. Well, another option for that as well is maybe you have your salaries and your GL budget for the year, so it could be taken into account in your budget as well. For those of you who have jobs, you might want to take into account your job budgets, of course our sales taxes, and then also Cortana Intelligence. So now with Cortana Intelligence, we can have NAV predict your future cash flow. So what it does is, based on data you've already posted, you could probably have a bunch of different diverse patterns in that data. Well, Cortana is going to try and look into your past posted history, try to recognize those patterns, and then base your future cash flow on those patterns. So that's an interesting one if you want to play around with Cortana, where you could create multiple cash flow forecasts and maybe have one based on Cortana and have one based on your other sources, and kind of compare the two. It would be an interesting comparison. All right, so that's a little bit of background on cash flow forecasting. So then why don't we move into NAV? That's everyone's favorite part, to actually move into NAV and see how cash flow would be set up and then how we can use it. All right, so let me open NAV. All right, make sure you guys are seeing that. Yep, you are. And let's start with the cash flow chart of accounts. So on my menu here, I'm under the accountant profile, and under that profile, you do have a menu for cash flow. So I'm going to look at the cash flow forecasts. First thing we want to look at for setups is the chart of cash flow accounts. So I'm going to select that. So here in Kronos, we're using the Kronos USA company. They have their cash flow chart of accounts set up similar to the cash flow sources we talked about as we saw on that PowerPoint a few minutes ago. So let's just take a look at some of those different cash flow accounts and how they're set up and the different types that there are. First, let's look at, here's open receivables. Okay, so I'm going to click edit. So on our receivables, you can see there's a source type field, or I'm sorry, on a cash flow account card, and this is for receivables. This is pretty simple. We're going to just select the source type of receivables. So it's going to pull all of your receivables from the customer ledger entry table. Okay, so that's a pretty simple setup. So that's one example. Payables would be set up that exact same way. Down at the bottom here, we have one called cash flow funds. And if we look at the setup of that card, we can see our source type is liquid funds. And then we have to tell it what GL accounts those liquid funds should pull from. So here under GL integration, we'll see we want to pull it from balance, so from our actual general ledger. And then the GL account filter. So we're taking into account all of our liquid asset accounts. Okay, so that would be an example of liquid funds or linking to specific GL accounts. Another one we have set up here too is building occupancy. So if you look at that card, this one we're actually taking from our GL budget. So we want to include our future budget for expenses in our cash flow statement. So we would select the source type of GL budget. Our integration would then be from the budget, not from the actual general ledger. And what GL accounts do we want to take into account? Okay. So here we're taking into account our 3 building occupancy cost accounts. All right, so that would be how we can add in a line for any budget expenses. And then maybe one last example here we could look at is fixed asset disposals. We talked about fixed assets a little bit before, but if we look at that card, again, our source type would be fixed asset disposal, and it would be linked to our fixed asset ledgers. All right. So step 1 would be to set up your chart of cash flow accounts. And again, setting up this account, it's very similar to how you would set up your regular chart of accounts. You know, what information do you want to see in your cash flow? The second setup screen we would want to look at is our cash flow setup. Okay, so for this, I'm going to go to Departments, and I'm going to go to Application Setup. And I'm going to select under Financial Management, Cash Flow. And under Tasks, we'll select the Cash Flow Setup. All right. So let's review the fast tabs here on the setup screen. The first one here under the General Fast tab, here you can set the system up to automatically update the cash flow forecasts. The options here are never daily and weekly. What this will do, if you select daily or weekly, it'll automatically set up a job queue entry in your job queue, and that service will then automatically update your cash flow. Okay, under the Accounts Fast tab, here you can set up predefined cash flow accounts for running the cash flow calculation. So here you'll see what is your receivable CF account, which is your cash flow account from your cash flow chart of accounts. You would go ahead and you would select that. So here you would set up all the defaults for the different types of accounts. On the Numbering Fast tab, we would need a number series for our cash flow forecast, so we can set up and select that cash flow forecast number series. The Tax Fast tab. Here is where you would tell it whether you want to take into account sales tax or VAT tax. It will ask you to specify your taxable periods, whether it's a monthly tax statement or a quarterly tax statement or a yearly tax statement. And then here what your tax account is. Do you pay it using a vendor, or do you just want to set it up to go to your sales tax payable accounts in the general ledger? And then finally, again, new to 2017 is Cortana Intelligence. So using that machine learning to predict our future cash flow. With that, you would have to set up the Azure API URL for your cash flow for the machine learning, and then also the period type and the historical periods that you want to look at. All right. So once the cash flow setup page is complete, that is really the 2 setups, cash flow chart of accounts and cash flow setup, that you have to complete to run cash flow or to create that initial forecast. One of the other things I wanted to look at is when we set up that cash flow forecast card, it'll ask us if we want to set up based on our base payment terms or our cash flow payment terms. So I just want to quick review what that actually means. So I'm going to go to a customer card. And I'm going to look at the Canon group. On your payments fast tab of the customer card, you of course have your payment terms code. Okay, well now there is also a cash flow payment terms code. You'll see the regular payment terms are set to 14 days, the cash flow is set to 21 days. Well, what does this mean? So for example, the Canon group always pays a little bit late. They never pay in that 14-day time period. It always seems to be around the 21 days. So to make your cash flow forecast more accurate, you could put in 21 days for the cash flow payment terms instead of that base 14 days. So now our cash flow will record that receivables due in the 21-day time period, not the 14-day, which they should be paying in. So that can make your cash flow forecast a bit more accurate. Now this cash flow payment terms code can be set up obviously per customer, so on all the customer records, and it's also available on vendors for when you pay. So maybe on certain vendors, again, you're supposed to pay in 30 days, but you're really paying in 60 days. So you can adjust that in the cash flow payment terms on the vendor card as well. All right, so now that our setups are complete, why don't we go ahead and create our first cash flow forecast. So I'm going to close the customer card. I'm going to go back to my cash flow menu, and I'm going to look at cash flow forecasts. All right, so I have one set up here for my cash flow for January 2019. So let's review the setups of that. All right, so on this cash flow forecast card, you can specify a number of different rules to use on your forecast. For example, we just talked about the cash flow payment terms. Right here, consider CF payment terms is a checkbox. In order for the cash flow to consider those additional cash flow terms, we would have to check mark that box. If that box is not checked, it's going to use the default payment terms code on your customer and vendors. Consider discount. Should the cash flow forecast take into account payment discounts that you take, so using those payment discount due dates or your payment discounts given from vendors? That's optional, or should it just consider the regular due date field? Show in chart on Roll Center. Some of your profiles have the ability to show your cash flow chart on the Roll Center screen. If you want this cash flow forecast as the default chart on your Roll Center, you would check mark that field. And then on the right here, we have our GL budget from and to. So in our cash flow forecast, if we're using the budget in any of our forecast entries, we would need to tell the forecast what is the time frame for looking at that budget. Then we have manual payments from and to. We're going to go over that next with the manual revenue expenses. But again, from our manual revenue and expense, which dates do we want it to look at? How far in the future do we want it to look? And then of course, the default GL budget to use for our cash flow forecast. All right, so that is some of the setups that we can do to create our cash flow forecast. Now we just mentioned here our dates for our manual revenue and expenses. What is that? I'm gonna click OK to close the card. Go back to my cash flow. Here you'll see cash flow manual revenues and manual expenses. So what is this? Well, it's important that we are able to include amounts that we cannot yet post. For example, future payment of salaries, revenues in the future, And we can do this by entering these in the manual revenue and expense section. So in the manual revenue section, here you can see in Kronos some different revenues they want to consider each month that is not yet posted. Okay, so they want to consider some rental revenues, some financial assets, and also some private investments. Okay, so if we look at this list, we can set up the date that that manual revenue starts, what that revenue amount is, and is that amount something that we get daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, or yearly? And then, of course, when does this end? Okay, so you can set up an unlimited number of manual revenues to be included in the forecast. And the cash flow manual expenses is this exact same, except for it's the reverse. It's your expenses. So here we're considering personnel costs, running costs, and finance costs. And these are separate from everything else we've included in our cash flow chart of accounts based on GL entries and budget entries. All right. So why don't we go ahead now and we can run the cash flow worksheet. So I'm going to go back to the cash flow forecast. And I'm going to select the cash flow forecast for January of 2019. And up on the ribbon, I'm going to go to the cash flow worksheet. All right, so now we want to create that cash flow worksheet. So I'm going to suggest worksheet lines. Okay, and here asks what source types do we want to include of all the source types that we've talked about. I generally check mark all of them, that I want to include everything, and that will basically populate everything in our cash flow chart of accounts. It defaults the budget and the budget name from our cash flow worksheet card. So basically then from here, we just have to click OK. And it's going to look at all our history tables. It's going to look at what we wanted to look at in the general ledger, in the GL budgets, and then also in our manual revenue and expenses. And it's going to calculate out all of our cash flow forecast entries. Now, in reviewing these cash flow entries, you can add lines manually that you want to include. You can modify these lines, and you can delete these lines. For example, maybe there is a posted sales invoice here that you just, is in dispute, whatever. You don't want to include it in your cash flow forecast. You can just highlight that line, and you can delete that line from your cash flow worksheet. All right, down below here, you'll see an error and warning section. The only time this is used is if you are using the Cortana Intelligence. Okay, it'll give you errors and warnings for that piece of the puzzle. All right, so once you've reviewed all of your cash flow entries, you've made any adjustments or changes that you wanted to make, then we need to register the cash flow entries. And that register will again, save these cash flow entries so they're available for all of your different reporting needs. So let's go ahead and click register. And we'll see that they are successfully registered and they're deleted from our cash flow worksheet. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. All right, so now that we actually have cash flow entries, how can we view them? What reporting options are available? So the first reporting option, let's open our cash flow card. And from here, you can see our cash flow forecast statistics in the fact box. Okay, so these details are based on the total number of periods entered in the cash flow forecast card. So from here, we're doing January 1st to December 31st of 2019. So this is the total amounts in each of these areas. Again, if they're blue and highlighted, you can drill down into that and see the detail that makes up that balance. So that's one on-screen way of viewing our forecast statistics. All right, a report that is kind of nice to look at. On the Navigate tab, you'll see CF availability by periods, so our cash flow availability. And this allows you another on-screen look at the progress of your cash flow period by period. Okay, so here you can select how you want to view this by day, week, month, quarter, year, and if you want to view the net change or the balance at date. All right, so another on-screen look at our cash flow forecast. On the home ribbon, you'll see a report called cash flow date. Cash flow date list. And this is going to show a list of your cash flow entries for a time period specified. So here, if I say, let's do January 1st, 2019, number of intervals, I want to see the next 8 weeks. So I'm going to put 8, and my interview length, of course, is NAV formulas are 1W for 1 week. If you worked in recurring journals in different areas of inventory, you'll know that 1W is week, M is month, Y is year, Q is quarter. So I want to see the next 8 weeks. All right, I'm going to go ahead and preview. All right, so this is, again, it's a good report to take a look at all of your different cash flow forecast buckets and by time frame, by different periods. This report, again, too, we can also save this to Excel, PDF, or Word. All right, what else can we do with our cash flow forecast? If I go back to my cash flow chart of accounts, this in itself, just like your regular general ledger chart of accounts, is a report of your cash flow accounts. So this, when you're setting up your chart of cash flow accounts, think about, how you want to view your reports, because this is a very easy way to see your data and an easy way for reporting, looking at your cash flow chart. Just like your GL chart of accounts, if we look at the the limit totals filter, we can add date filters here. And maybe I just want to see my cash flow, through the month of March. Well, if I can do dates right here. 31, 19, there we go. Okay, so this is an option. You can do your date filters right in your chart of accounts, and you can also send this to Excel as well. All right, our next option would be our account schedules. Okay, so for those of you who set up account schedules in NAV. All right, so if I look at my account schedules, here in Kronos, we do have a couple cash flow statements set up. And if I edit one of these account schedules, of course I picked the one that's blank. Let me go down to the next one here, and edit the account schedule. For those of you who have set up account schedules in the past, you've seen a type of GL entry and then GL budget entry. So now there's also options for the cash flow accounts as well. So you can take your information from that cash flow entry table. All right, let me close that. We also have the analysis by dimensions. You can set up a cash flow analysis view. And if we edit and look at the one here, for those of you, again, that are using analysis views, they've added a new account source for the cash flow account. It used to be just the GL account. All right, so that's another option to create your analysis view on the cash flow. And then finally, on our role center, let me get back to my role center. Certain role centers within NAV allow you to have a cash flow forecast chart part on it, okay? So this chart will, it'll display your cash flow graphically, of course, right in your role center. You can look and change at the chart options. Do you want to show accumulated cash, change in cash, or combined? What's the start date you want to see for your cash flow forecast? What's the period length? And then how do you want to group it? Okay, so when you change any of these, you can click Recalculate Forecast to update that forecast. One thing that's interesting about the chart is here, if you kind of hover over each of the different colors, you can see that right now I'm looking at it by quarter, and I'm on the purchase order section. Here's my manual expense section. You can see in the bubble, it shows the actual total of the expense. And then any one of these, if I were to go and click on that, it would give me the detail behind that specific cash flow source that I selected. All right, so there's a lot of different things here you can do with the cash flow chart. Lastly, we've talked about earlier on that there's a new option to 2017 for assisted setup. I just wanted to look at that really quick. On the accountant role center, you can see on the ribbon there is an assisted setup section. And you'll notice there's one here for setting up the cash flow forecast. So if you wanted an easy way to set up the cash flow forecast, you could use this assisted setup. Now, if I click the Actions ribbon and start that setup, there's a few different screens it takes you through with questions you need to answer, and it does a basic setup of your cash flow forecast. So if I click Next, okay, I'll go ahead and delete my existing one, that's fine. So it kind of walks you through some of those setup windows that we talked about. Which are our cash accounts, our liquid assets. Okay, so we would drill down here and select those from our general ledger. How often do you want us to update that cash flow? Again, you saw that on the cash flow setup screen. Do you want to enable Cortana Intelligence? I'm going to unselect that for now. Again, in the cash flow setup, here's our questions on taxes. How often do we pay taxes? What's our payment window? Do we pay to a vendor or pay off of a GL account? And that's really it. It'll go ahead and it will set up a generic cash flow forecast based on those few bits of information. Okay, now one thing you'll notice is I did have kind of an extended out chart of cash flow accounts before that I had set up. But when you use that assisted setup, these are really the buckets that it sets it up in. It's not real pretty, but it is the different source type buckets that are available. And then from here, you could go ahead and modify and add different things in. So there is an easy way to set up cash flow forecasting using assisted setup, but more than likely, you're still going to have to come in here and make some tweaks for your specific forecasting needs. All right, that is pretty much it for cash flow forecasting. And maybe Angie, I'll turn it back to you and see if we have any questions.
Yes, we do, Jenny. One question is, can Cortana calculate the cash flow payment term code for you?
Good question. So Cortana Intelligence will not figure out what time frame your customers are paying or you're paying your vendors in and automatically populate the cash flow payment terms on that master record. So it won't do that, but this is what it does do. It uses the Azure Machine Learning Service to help you make your forecasts. For example, forecasts from Cortana Intelligence can help you predict and avoid cash deficits. And this service combines your historical information with your current postings for payables and receivables, including postings that are due in the future. So that would include purchase orders, sales orders, posted sales and purchase invoices, and also posted sales and purchase credit memos. So it looks at your historical data to help you to predict the future. So it will not figure out what time frame your customers are actually paying in or what you're actually paying your vendors in and auto-populate that cash flow payment terms for you. However, if you do want to populate the cash flow payment terms and you would like to get an idea of maybe what they're actually paying in, don't forget on customers and also on vendors, but on customers, there's an entry statistics page off of each customer record. And there's a field that says the average collection period in a certain time range. So that will show you what your customers are actually paying in. I hope that helps.
Great, Jenny. Thank you for explaining that question. If anyone else has any further questions, please type them into the questions box and we will get them called out. And I just want to thank Jenny for doing the presentation on cash flow forecasting and Microsoft Dynamics NAV 2018. And we also would like to let you know of our other events that are taking place. So check out our website and register for any other future events that we may have. We do have Jeff Pergolski doing his webinar tomorrow on the best new features in NAV 2018 for accounting, sales, and IT professionals. So if you're interested in attending that webinar, please register. And then we have a few next week as well. Jenny will be doing another presentation on electronic payments in Microsoft Dynamics NAV, and ExperLogic will be hosting their webinar on delivering complex quotes in seconds with ExperLogic CPQ. So if any of those topics interest you, please register and have any of your colleagues and friends register as well. These are free. And we also want to remind you of our conference that will be coming up in April. It's actually April 18th and 19th at the Chula Vista Resort and Conference Center in the Wisconsin Dells. So that is a free conference for you to attend. So we encourage you to register for that, and we hope to see you there. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Jenny, for the presentation, and we look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. Have a great day, everyone.